Thank you again for organizing this and for the terrific honor to be asked to give a plenary talk. My first HBES conference was in 2000 in Amherst. A few of you may recall that. I was a grad student at the time. Got married, I think, a week or two right afterwards, so quite memorable in other ways too. But it's really a marvel to be in this capacity now rather than a grad student. At the time, stressed about just giving a podium presentation, now up here on a bigger podium. But again, thank you for the opportunity. I can't guarantee I'm going to blow you away the next hour. I'm going to do my best. This is one of my daughters. She's blown away near Flagstaff. Anyone been to this place before? Several of you recognize this, yes? An interesting place. This kind of happened to the plane as I was landing yesterday. We had to circle twice as the air pressure, warm air warm air meeting cold air, and at any rate, I was wondering if I was going to make it to this podium as I was landing yesterday afternoon. But again, I can't promise I'm going to blow away your minds, but at least my daughter did there in a fun way. What am I going to talk about the next hour? I'm going to talk about a variety of things, drawing upon these kinds of works as well as other stuff I'll allude to, but this does amount, as John noted, to taking an integrative evolutionary approach to human reproduction, particularly hormones and life history theory with respect to changing family dynamics. So in our time, I'm going to touch on mothers, fathers, dogs, kids, and aging individuals. Wide-ranging. There's no way I can do this exhaustively, so instead I'm just going to touch on some things, try to provoke some thoughts. Maybe this will guide some sparks for new research avenues, for example. All of us try to reconstruct footprints of our past. How did our ancestors live, including hominin forebears? How can we do so? Well, in some cases, literally, we may have footsteps to help us. Many of you are familiar with the Laetoli footprints from northern Tanzania, but here you have more recent footprints from northwest Kenya about 1.5 million years ago. But one reconstruction suggested that there might be multi-male groups 1.5 million years ago foraging, perhaps cooperative foraging or hunting. I don't know, provocative, but starts a conversation about reconstructing ancestral social lives. What lines of evidence might we bring to bear to do so? I again, in this limited time, cannot do all this, but I'll just scratch the surface of this effort by saying we should use every line of evidence possible. Not just the hunter-gatherer ethnographic record, not just the fossil and archaeological record, not just the comparative ape record. We should use everything we can, all hands on deck, to do the difficult work of trying to reconstruct ancestral family life. So when I talk about changing families today, I mean it in two ways. The first is, I mean, how have human families changed with respect to our ape kin? So in what ways do human hunter-gatherers live in families in ways that differ from, say, chimps, gorillas, bonobos, and orangs? And the second way is, in what way do human families around the world today live in families that differ in some respects from our hunter-gatherer cousins? So I mean changing families in both ways, even though most of my emphasis will be on the latter. In reconstructions, like you can see these at the Smithsonian in DC, for example, you might imagine what robust Australopithecines, Neanderthals, Homo floresiensis, and others look like, but in turn we also ask about their families. Did they live in multi-male groups? Who cared for offspring? Just moms, or were there others involved? These, again, are difficult things to gain traction on, so we do the best we can, and some in the audience have done just this. I saw Sarah Hurdy over there, for example. Mothers and Others, a marvel for many of us, and helps guide, I think, an integrative approach to trying to tackle these kinds of things regarding reconstructions of ancestral family lives. What are some principles? Drawing upon some data. Here we're looking at endocranial volumes, a measure of brain volume, across the last 3.5 million years, different hominins represented here. One point I'll just make is that endocranial volumes were constantly changing, in part because body sizes were getting larger in the genus Homo the last 2 to 2.5 million years. This gets at the point that human families during hominin evolution changed in mosaic patterns. They did not change overnight. So whereas some have suggested that Ardipithecus, for example, evolved 4 million years ago with effectively long-term pair bonds and paternal investment, that's difficult to sustain in light of other lines of evidence like changes that are more continuous in endocranial volumes across the hominin time frame instead. Drawing upon the hunter-gatherer rich ethnographic work, one notable pattern is that in hunter-gatherer societies, moms do not raise their kids alone. These are not orangutans. Instead, a variety of caregivers, from dads to grandmas to older kin, play crucial roles in raising the next generation. We should draw upon the hunter-gatherer record and again, also look for ways in which our family lives today contrast with those among hunter-gatherers as depicted in the ethnographic record, although mindful that hunter-gatherers, as recently studied, also have foraging technologies, also have extended childhoods that do not extrapolate, say, to early Homo. We can say that convincingly now with dental reconstructions that talk about the pace of child development, and the pace of child development became modern with literally modern humans, not with Homo erectus, for example. And now it's spinning its wheels. Did I do something? No. So these are the life history traits we want to, that stand out when we compare ourselves with our ape kin. We tend to form long-term reproductive bonds within which we raise offspring. We draw upon a variety of allo-maternal caregivers. We have higher fertility and shorter interbirth intervals. You may have seen about a month ago there was something circulating on orangutan 8-year interbirth intervals. Again, gives you pause. How many of you have 8-year interbirth intervals? You might, but for very different reasons than, say, hunter-gatherers would, for example. But these are the life history traits that we want to try to understand as derived relative to our ape kin. There are a variety of models drawing upon phylogenetic and adaptive approaches to understand, say, the evolution of long-term bonds. I'm not going to go through this, but this is just to say, in this table from a review in the yearbook of Physical Anthro several years ago, bring some of these together. And drawing upon the comparative evidence, we would assume, for example, that long-term bonds originated probably with something like mate guarding, and then a sexual division of labor was a more recent phenomenon, a more recent add-on. And one of the other plenary talks will be by Rebecca Blige-Bird. She'll talk about the foraging sexual division of labor in a couple days. But with modern humans evolving 150 to 200,000 years ago in Africa, we've since expanded around the world with a small degree of interbreeding with hominins in sub-Saharan Africa, as well as Denisovans and Neanderthals, to give rise to the amazing family variation we find around the world today. So variation in terms of who you live with, how many marital partners are acceptable, what's expected of fathers, and so forth. And this represents effectively a rich natural lab. We're in a great place studying humans from an evolutionary perspective because we've got these tremendous variants with which we can try to understand within life history frameworks, for example, cultural evolutionary frameworks and so forth. And some of that variation hinges upon a variety of factors like these. To illustrate, subsistence mode, pastoralists tend to provide less direct care, for example, than hunter-gatherers. We could go on, and I'll come back to paternities as another variable in a little bit later in this talk too. What does this have to do with hormones? You guys all recognize this guy, I hope, Nico Tinbergen. So he has won Nobel Prize than probably all of us combined. He earned it the year after I was born, and that was for recognizing, among other things, in this perspective of ethology, that there are 4 complementary ways to approach any why question in biology, and mechanisms are complementary to adaptive thinking, as well as complementary to, say, phylogeny or evolutionary history, and so forth. So we draw upon that to recognize that hormones can play a role in terms of both constraining and reflecting what may be functional life history outcomes. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on only a handful of hormones. From the posterior pituitary, I'll talk about oxytocin and vasopressin. From the adrenals, I'll talk about DHEA and androstenedione. And then from the gonads, I'll talk about estradiol and testosterone. Sorry, other hormones. If you're a fan of some of these other hormones, I'm sorry. But maybe you got your fix this morning at some of the other talks. Hormones like testosterone are pleiotropic, meaning they have multiple effects. Furthermore, those effects are often integrative. So testosterone, as the avian folks long have noted, has multiple functions that can be integrated under, say, advancing mating effort. So in other words, there are a host of factors that align with life history theorizing. So that's kind of cool, and that bridges nicely, again, proximate and ultimate thinking. That's not just true of testosterone, that's true of other hormones. That's true of vasopressin. There are a variety of integrative models out there. The best models should combine the non-human and human work, should include some of the mood and cognitive work as well as the behavioral work, and so forth, but this is just a sampling. I'm not saying this is the best. If anything, this is quite dated in 2009, but with vasopressin, oxytocin, and so forth, each of these hormones, in a sense, has an integrative adaptive story. So now let's get going with moms a little bit, and to do that we'll go back to hunter-gatherers. Time for some trance dancing. That's some rock art from Platfontein in South Africa, a picture I took last summer, probably about 1,000 or 2,000 years ago. But just to also give a call out to a couple of recent works, if you're interested in hunter-gatherer families. Meehan and Crittenden's edited volume Childhood is fantastic, as is Borton-Jones' Demography. And Borton-Jones, some of you may know, was also a student of Tinbergen. So we get really close quickly in evolutionary family circles. But these are just a couple recent touchstones. If we look at hunter-gatherers, the average fertility, as Barry Hewlett showed in his compilation some years ago, is about 5 kids. And of those, maybe about half reach adolescence. So interestingly, in hunter-gatherers, survival rates of kids are not that different from chimps, whereas they're, if anything, they're higher than, say, bonobos or bonobos or orangutans. But imagine you're having 5 kids, and imagine 2 or 3 of those are surviving. With respect to reproductive scheduling, what do those tables from Robert Kelly's book point to? BI is birth interval, MAM is mean age of menarche or first menstruation, MAFB is mean age of first birth, MALB is mean age of last birth. If you're a hunter-gatherer, like among the Kung or Hadza, maybe you have your first child around age 20, your last in the mid to late 30s, not 50, but last mid to late 30s, and maybe you again have 4 or 5 kids, of which maybe 2 or 3 will survive. So if we're thinking of a hunter-gatherer backdrop to family, including reproductive scheduling, this is a good starting point. Furthermore, we'll then want to ask, how does our fertility scheduling compare with hunter-gatherer patterns? Although the Dogon of Mali are not hunter-gatherers, they're pastoralists, nonetheless they nicely illustrate the age-related patterning of female reproduction. And that pattern is that during the prime reproductive years, ages 20 to 34, what are women mostly doing? Are they cycling? No. So one of the other plenary talks where we'll hear about cycle-related shifts in a variety of phenotypes. Many talks at HBES will be on that, but from an evolutionary perspective, that's missing the spotlight during the peak reproductive years in hunter-gatherers, in which cycling is irregular. It's fairly rare. Why? Because during these peak reproductive years, women are pregnant or in a state of lactational amenorrhea, meaning they're lactating but not cycling. We'll come back to what implications that might have. One of the overarching patterns for families is declining fertility. So people are having fewer and fewer kids in more and more parts of the world. In turn, mothers are going through this less and less often. So there's a functional endocrinology of pregnancy and lactation. Hormones like progesterone play a role in preparing the uterus to gestate successfully a fetus. Hormones like prolactin play a role in preparing and supporting lactation. Hormones like estrogen, including estriol, during pregnancy seem to play an adaptive role of adding fat that can be burned during lactation. And then with respect to oxytocin, it provides support for a variety of functions that can be integrated under the promotion of maternal bonds or maternal behavior. So once again, a hormone like oxytocin, just like testosterone or other hormones, they're pleiotropic and they're integrative in their effects. To illustrate, Ruth Feldman's done tons of work in Israel, and one of her first studies on hormones and mothering was among moms, showing that oxytocin levels as measured in blood were positively related to various maternal behaviors. Been work with a variety of labs doing things like asking women to BF or breastfeed versus HD or hold an infant, and if you breastfeed, your oxytocin levels went up, but that was not true when holding the offspring, at least in this particular study. Others have suggested maybe even contact is sufficient to increase oxytocin. The point is, this is part of the evidence behind this earlier synthesis of oxytocin's effects. And then boiled down to life history theory, this opens up a conversation of that trade-off between current versus future reproduction. Or put another way, should you mother or should you mate? How are hormones involved? After you've had a baby, for example, there's less endocrine support for sex, lower estrogens and testosterone. Furthermore, if you're having sex, including orgasm, orgasm is is associated with a spike in oxytocin. So in terms of the naturalistic stimuli that'll give you the biggest oxytocin boost in your lives, breastfeeding or orgasm are at the top of the list. So maybe you get less of that reinforcement through less frequent orgasms. Your hands are full, there's a lot going on, shift in life history again towards parenting, but what does that come at expense to? Perhaps that comes at expense to marital quality. That relationship with the child's father, for example, might suffer. In meta-analysis, this is largely drawing on Western samples. Parents have lower marital quality than non-parents, and those effects seem stronger among women than men, especially of young kids. Some of these findings show up in longitudinal studies, like in Portugal, where there's both a decrease in positive measures between couples as well as an increase in negative measures in couples. The longer, let's go, I think it's 3 months and then 30 months, or 2.5 years after you've had a kid. So in other words, having a kid can be a challenge to a parenting relationship. What else may suffer? Sex. What are these peaks and troughs representing? They're representing cross-sectional data reconstructions from DHS, or Demographic and Health Survey analyses of women's sexual behavior during peak reproductive years. The troughs are late pregnancy and lactational amenorrhea. The peaks are during times at which females are cycling. So these are whopping effects, folks. And again, bear that in mind when we talk about cycle-related shifts in sexuality-related phenotypes, for example. Another illustration, former PhD student Michelle Escasadorn in Manila, Philippines, showed that controlling for relationship duration and age, women's FSFI scores, so this is the female sexual function inventory, it's the gold standard of female sexual inventories, that those scores on that inventory dipped after you had a baby and were not cycling, but then they seem to increase after you'd had a baby and began cycling. But the best predictor of FSFI scores were the longer since you last had your baby. She also looked at estradiol and testosterone levels, but those hormones were not related to this. So rather it was the time since you'd had a baby. The largest quantitative study looking at fatherhood and sexuality was done by my Jamaican collaborator, Maureen Sams-Vaughan, and I. And this entailed collecting data from about 3,400 fathers of newborns, asking questions like, how many times have you had sexual intercourse the past 7 days? And a sizable fraction reported not having any sex. You can see 42% of respondents. Overall, during the past 30 days, how satisfied have you been with your sex life? Interestingly, most men reported being mostly or very satisfied, even though I think this is also a time, late pregnancy and early postpartum, where you maximize the sexual conflict over sexual desire during the reproductive years. So even though guys are saying, I'm pretty satisfied, and take a step further back, there's tons of literature on sex differences and sexual desire during reproductive years. This is probably when it peaks, folks, is during late pregnancy and early postpartum. Other patterns, sex drive is more variable than erections, ejaculations, problem assessments, and so forth. And note that some 30% of men reported 2 or more partners the last 12 months, so something I'll come back to in a bit. This is inversely scored, but this is also just showing that one of the best predictors of sexual satisfaction is relationship quality. So the way to read this is, the higher your relationship quality, the more sexually satisfied men reported in the sample of fathers. What happens if you are a single parent? So most of the small literature on parenting and sex focuses on partnered individuals. What if you are a single parent? Here, Justin Garcia and colleagues and I used Singles in America data, so a demographically represented U.S. sample, to try to gain traction on this issue. And there are 2 ways to look at this. You might think, as I did, that if you're a parent of a young kid, you'll be obsessed with parenting effort. Your hands are tied, you're busy. Who has time for sex? Or you might think, I'm a single parent, I could use some emotional support from a new partnership or some additional caregiving support. I need to find a new mate. And what we found is there's more support for the latter. If anything, there were no decreases in mating or parenting effort mating effort measures here. Instead, they were the same between single parents of older kids or single non-parents, or they were higher. So more support for the latter view than the former, contrary to what I was thinking. So how are reproductive lives changing? Again, one of the biggest things happening is we're just having fewer and fewer kids, which is why at HBES there's a huge literature on cycle-related shifts and all kinds of things. But again, if you take a step back thinking of hunter-gatherer reproductive scheduling, this is really anomalous, folks. It's more normative for late teens and early 20s, as women maybe are starting their reproductive careers, and then relationships dissolve, you're looking for a new partner. But as Jane Lancaster and Hilly Kaplan have pointed out in a book chapter, we should think about things like mate choice or having sex. Probably most of our ancestors were conceived when our moms were lactating but cycling. An endocrine milieu of lactation, not cycling, without lactational hormones involved. And that's a different mind frame, I think, to bring to bear. So I hope that kind of provokes some thinking about this. Plus, just think of everyday social life. I miss my kids. I have 2 kids. But how is our life different if we've got a kid that we're holding, we're interacting with, and so forth, versus not? That'll eventually get us to dogs, as we'll see in a bit too. But at any rate, those are just a few things to consider. There's also a larger set of circumstances drawing upon hormones, the biomedicalization of births, so C-sections or synthetic versions of oxytocin, pitocin, for example, variable lactation patterns. All of this ties into differential oxytocin effects on potential parenting or child developmental consequences worthy of considering. Let's shift from moms to dads, though. I'm going to kind of gloss over stuff, just touching on a few highlights in this literature. It's huge now, folks. When I was a grad student and in 2000, again, attending HBES the first time, there was almost nothing done on this. Now it's huge. So I can't do justice to it. I'll only, again, touch on a few examples here. The only study published thus far on hunter-gatherers testosterone and fatherhood is done by Martin Muller and colleagues, in which they found among Hadza men living with their kids, they had lower afternoon testosterone levels than Hadza men who did not live with kids. And that was different from their neighboring Datok pastoralist neighbors, so they basically live in the same northern Tanzanian ecology, but in a different family environment, in which they predicted and also found there were no differences in testosterone profiles related to fatherhood status among the Datok, and unlike the Hadza. There are now 5 studies on testosterone and human polygynous marriage. I did the first as part of my PhD work in Lamu Island in Kenya, in which both in mornings and afternoons, men with 2 wives had higher testosterone levels than other men. But the latest done in the Gambia showed that men with multiple wives also had higher testosterone. So there's now a decent literature even on this aspect of men's testosterone and family relationships, even as polygynous marriages themselves are declining globally. The first study showing outside of North America that fathers had lower testosterone levels both in mornings and afternoons in a cross-sectional design, a study led by an undergrad from Harvard, Jeff Yang, with whom I worked. He's now at Duke as a thoracic surgeon. He gave up bioanthro in his quick forays, apparently, but he can save some of us, which is a good thing, I suppose, if we need our heart surgeons subsequently. But who carries now arguably the mantle of hormones and fatherhood? Lee Gettler, many of you know him and his work, and I think the gold standard of hormones and fatherhood work now draws upon the longitudinal work in the Philippines he and colleagues like Chris Kazawa have been doing for a number of years, and this study stands out above all because it shows in longitudinal design in a prospective study that becoming a father decreases your testosterone. So in a cross-sectional study we can't infer causality, whereas here you can say that testosterone decreases when you become a father, particularly a father of a really young kid. So the first attempt to summarize this, now some years old, pointed out there's lots of evidence for variation in male testosterone levels with respect to family variables like partnership status or fatherhood status. The literature, again, continues to expand since then. I'll just say a few other things on this. All of you are familiar with the weird concept. This is a nice literature insofar as there's a lot of non-weird samples represented. There are people from the Gambia, from Kenya, the Hadza, and people from the US and Canada. So it runs a gamut, but it actually, I think, nicely addresses the weird criticism that you have no doubt heard about with respect to social science research writ large. We're at a stage now, too, where I think we've moved beyond the categorical differences, so do fathers have lower testosterone than non-fathers, to looking at other individual measures. And yet, there are no studies yet that have given men, like fathers, testosterone to ask if fathering outcomes vary, even though in clinical studies, plenty of men are being given testosterone. This just has not been asked in those settings. Moving beyond testosterone, oxytocin in mammals likely originated with maternal care, and then it's been co-opted into other social relationships, including partnerships, including fathering relationships, and again, those dogs that we'll come back to. And this is just illustrating one study. Again, the literature is too big to really do justice to here in a few slides, but new lovers, both men and women, showed higher oxytocin levels than singles, as you can see here. The sophistication of many of these studies includes intranasal spray studies, so this is thought to exert central effects. That's a longer discussion if that's true, but putting that aside for the moment. In this study in Switzerland, men but not women in a partnership discussion, the men given oxytocin showed a relative weighting of more positive to negative content during that standardized lab-based discussion of marital exchange, basically. So in other words, this shows that giving men a squirt of oxytocin up the nose shaped, at least in a lab setting, partnership dynamics, but the same was not true, interestingly, of the women in that study. Back to Ruth Feldman's work and her colleagues, oxytocin levels positively related to affect synchrony, but and then vasopressin, almost no work's been done on vasopressin in human male families, even though the VOL research, among other lines of evidence, suggests we ought to be sniffing up this alley too, which is a nudge to the next slide. But before I get there, many of you are familiar with this study, and this showed that vasopressin receptor polymorphisms were related in a large Swedish study to pair bonding quality and marital status outcomes, but the effect sizes were pretty small, something to bear in mind. This is the closest parallel we have, arguably, to the VOL research. But back to sniffing oxytocin, Jim Rilling and his group at Emory have been having fathers sniff oxytocin or vasopressin, and in one of their latest studies, they show that there were effects on fathers of oxytocin relative to placebo in viewing photos of their own children, but not hearing infant cries, but no vasopressin effects. So this is one of the first studies giving fathers intranasal vasopressin, but found no effects. But one might ask about the lab-based setting here. There may be arguably an ecological validity context here in which you might want to stimulate a protective defense response, let's say, to elicit a vasopressin paternal response. But that said, this just gives you a flavor of some of the larger hormones in fathering research. So to summarize, it's a huge literature now, yet there are relatively few experimental field studies. Note that contrast between baseline versus reactive research designs. And yet all this stuff is also contingent on a developmental course. So how the family in which you're raised makes you think about the way in which you'll become a father and what you're expected to do as a father. That's certainly true of me anecdotally, but I'm sure all of you could lend your own personalized account to that same view. I'm just going to share a few more slides now on testosterone and fatherhood with this Jamaican study just published as part of a special issue co-edited by Katie Starkweather and Kermit Anderson in Human Nature. And this is part of that same cohort study in Jamaica alluded to earlier with respect to sexuality. There were about 350 fathers in the second wave who participated in this testosterone and fathering study. And I'll just allude to this classic ethnographic work in the Caribbean, particularly Jamaica. My mother who fathered me, this is the idea that with more fluid partnership relationships, it might be a mother who plays both the maternal and paternal role effectively. You can say, well, that's kind of silly, but nonetheless, this gets into the idea ethnographically that there's a salient role of stepfathers and more fluid relationships that means we might look at things like whether or not stepfathers have higher testosterone levels than biological fathers. That was the driving impetus behind this study. One of the hypotheses we wanted to test, there were several others. Back to individual variables rather than, group differences. We also looked at partnership dynamics. Again, a large sample of about 350 fathers of 18 to 24-month-old children. And what did we find? Sadly, depressingly, we could only recruit 6 stepfathers, so we could not test the hypothesis we were driven to most want to test. So this remains untested thus far, even though I think all of you in this audience appreciate the relevance of paternity to human male life history. Sad. Another test of this, less ideal, showed null effects. Fathers' relationship quality was inversely related to their testosterone level. And this gets at the idea that mothers of young children are often some of the best regulators of access to those children. Fathers can't directly access that child, especially if the mom is breastfeeding the child. So often that access is negotiated in a partnership, and in turn it's worthwhile to test something like relationship quality with respect to father's testosterone. And it's notable that this was significant, but the measures of paternal investment were not. And in a scatter plot, you can see this, it's noisy. So it also means that you could not predict a man's paternal or relationship quality based on his testosterone level, for example. The last tidbit on fatherhood and sexuality, or fatherhood and testosterone, what about sexuality? So back to Cebu City in the Philippines, in longitudinal work, Lee and colleagues showed that fathers, or men who became fathers, had less of a decline in testosterone the more they were having sex. So that's the first study that's linked sex and fatherhood and testosterone in the same breath. David Putz and colleagues, using college samples in the US, showed that there can be some interesting effects between testosterone and sexuality, some of which may mask each other. So there they showed that relationship status was, so if you're in a relationship, you have lower testosterone, sociosexual psychology, positive related to testosterone, but number of sex partners negatively related to testosterone. So then we thought, well, what about these Jamaican guys, basically? So we had all these same paternal, we had all these same sexuality measures as you saw previously, but we found completely null effects. So in testing whether or not, in other words, fathers of 18 to 24 months old would have higher testosterone if they had multiple sex partners recently, the answer was no. Who needs kids anyway? So now we move into dogs. We have fewer and fewer kids, both for young couples when it's hard to get started, you're in grad school forever, or empty nesters like my parents who indulge their dog in a way that I was never indulged. You can devote tremendous time and resources to your pet dog. You can have bark boxes delivered. I'm not being paid to say that either. How long has this relationship held? In southern France, this cave shows footprints of a boy side by side with what's either a wolf or an early dog. And you might say, I wonder if the wolf ate him, or perhaps this is the start of that deep bond. The kind of indulgence, though, we might see in local pet stores does not necessarily apply cross-culturally. Sharon Young, a UNLV grad student, now PhD, and I conducted a cross-cultural survey using eHRAF in which we found little evidence of the kind of deep indulgence you see in the US and how people care for pets like dogs or cats cross-culturally. If anything, dogs are often commonly physically abused, sometimes killed, sometimes eaten, and so forth. Sometimes breastfed, though, worthy of reflection, too. I'm collaborating with a psychology colleague in Bangalore, India, to survey students on their attitudes towards both pet and feral dogs, so eventually we'll have something more to say on this, in a place in which the views of dogs are rapidly changing. So you find pictures of dogs like the upper left, a coddled beast at that, but plenty of feral dogs wandering the streets. But note, when you hear Mike Tomasello's keynote in a few days, ask yourselves, if to the degree you hear about dog cognitive research, who are those dogs? Are the feral dogs represented there? Arguably the same criticism, the weird criticism raised of human subjects, applies currently to dog cognitive research. Dogs may also help you find your match, as Justin Garcia and colleagues and I found in Match.com members with pets in their profile. Two key findings from that. Women were more discerning of a potential partner's association with pets, and then also pet dogs served as stronger social barometers than pet cats. Probably not surprising. Angelic dogs they may be. The first study showing that interactions with dogs can change hormones both in humans and in dogs, done in 2003 in South Africa. Note, as the next few slides will emphasize, that oxytocin levels went up in about a 15-minute interaction, sort of petting and rolling around with a friendly dog, both in the human and in the dog itself. Several other studies have looked at correlational designs between oxytocin responses to pet interactions, particularly dogs. So in another study done at Colorado State University, for example, at the end of a long work day, when women but not men came home and interacted with their dog for the next 25 minutes, their oxytocin levels went up. What if you get the dogs to sniff some oxytocin? So intranasal oxytocin sprays given to the dogs. What does that do? So in Japan, there's been some really cool research doing just this, showing that dogs given intranasal oxytocin versus placebo are both more engaged with their dog social companions as well as with people. Furthermore, if you look at long gaze dogs, so I think there were 8 in this sample. So in other words, dogs engaging in longly, is that a word? Nowadays, I guess we can say words like that. I can gaze into Carol, my grats. I'll be a long-gazing dog for a moment. That this may induce an oxytocin increase in the human with whom the dog is gazing longingly, but not in a short gaze or the wolves in their study. And then follow-up study, give the dogs oxytocin or saline. The dogs given oxytocin elicit increases in the oxytocin of women, but not, I'm sorry, the female dogs given oxytocin, not the male dogs, elicit increases in human oxytocin during the subsequent gaze. So anyway, it ties into the discussions about hormones and dogs, in which there's now a pretty cool literature developing in recent years, with now one published study on cats. This is not the same, though, insofar as these are not they're not the cat owners. These are people interacting with an unfamiliar dog or cat, and the short description of this is that interaction with a cat sucked the oxytocin out of the people, especially if they had owned many cats previously. Let's shift to kids. Childhood. Humans, again, have an extended childhood. Why do we have an extended childhood? Arguably to learn, to forage, to engage in the social learning we need to succeed as adults and so forth. What does that have to do with hormones? It opens up a discussion of adrenarchy, or the rise in adrenal androgens like DHEA and androstenedione that precede the rise of hormones from the gonads like estradiol or testosterone at puberty. How is childhood changing compared to hunter-gatherer childhood? So think of hunter-gatherer play in mixed age-sex groups. Again, you don't have a bunch of kids all of the same age packed inside of a classroom together, nor do you have parents who are refereeing a soccer game for those very kids, for example. There's a huge literature, I'll come back to how this is related to kids, on testosterone in adult male aggression, that in an older meta-analysis, John Archer's, but also in a newer meta-analysis, just published last year, talks about the patterns in testosterone responses to competition like sports, including team sports, and so forth. One might ask if we want to extend this into so-called esports, electronic sports. This is basically another way of relabeling and repackaging video games. So when I was a young kid, we played Atari, and then we gave up on that. You know, we moved on to do other things, but we're in a world now where people, where this is being more normalized to continue your gaming experience, in part because Vegas casinos want to normalize the millennial environment for esports to maybe capture that young millennial demographic that's not playing slots as often, let's say. So we ran a study testing whether or not guys playing League of Legends at UNLV's computer lab showed increases in hormones, including testosterone. But I'll just also point to Zimbardo. Many of you know him for the Stanford Prison Experiment. Also a book recently called The Demise of Guys. He talks about all the problems attached to young men being obsessed with porn and video gaming. So this is bad. Another view, though, is that this is just another avenue by which, in this PEEPS piece, young Chinese men form social bonds in a time where there's delayed onset of reproduction. So you can spin it different ways. With respect to hormones, There were no changes in the hormones we measured, including testosterone, while aldosterone decreased. The one other tidbit is games were only between 15 and 27 minutes in duration. The longer you played against people, the more testosterone, DHEA, and androstenedione increased. At any rate, that's just the latest part of this adult hormones and competition literature. What about kids? There are a small number of studies that have looked at baseline androstenedione and DHEA in relation to things like kids' aggression on playgrounds in Spain, for example. One study linking androstenedione and kids and boys, 5-year-olds, play on the playground. So PhD student Tim McHale in Las Vegas extended this work in, to my knowledge, the first study looking at hormone responses to playing athletic competition, namely football or soccer. And the two key findings here, first, testosterone was below sensitivity in all but a few subjects. So testosterone is not the responsive hormone to athletic competition in 8 to 10-year-old boys. That's not surprising, but it's clearly different from adults. What is responsive? DHEA and androstenedione, central to adrenarche. And this opens up discussion that whether you win or lose, perhaps it has feedback effects that may subsequently impact your likelihood of engaging in competition. That's the case with adult hormone responses. Perhaps that'll be true in kids. It's untested at this point. Tim extended this research more recently in Hong Kong with a larger sample, more participants playing both in a soccer competition and in a control scrimmage. Very similar patterns to what he found in Las Vegas. Again, it's not testosterone that's responsive, it's DHEA and androstenedione. Furthermore, androstenedione increased more in the match compared to the scrimmage. Back to adrenarche. So I think this is cool stuff. Those of you know the adult hormone and competition literature, you think back to 1980 and 81 when the dawn of that literature began. This is the dawn of thinking of hormones and competition in kids. Tim's next write-up will be on boys and girls hormone responses to math. So stay tuned. He's presenting Saturday, not on this, but on the soccer, if you want to hear more on this. And back to what might DHEA or androstenedione be doing? If we drew upon the non-reproductive season song sparrow literature, DHEA seems to regulate aggression via its conversion to testosterone. So could that be happening in 8 to 10-year-old boys? It's plausible, but we don't know thus far. Last, we all get older. What does that have to do with changing families? This is arguably the greatest time in human evolutionary history to study grandparents. Cole and Hertzwig pointed this out in their 2010 Behavioral and Brain Science paper. Why? Because we're living longer than ever before. Kids have died at lower rates than before, and we're yet to see the full drop in fertility that'll leave fewer young kids to grandparent, though that's coming. What's happening with advanced age? With respect to life history, you might expect declines in mating effort and increases in parenting and grandparenting effort. Now, what would that have to do with hormones? You might expect less hormonal support, as indeed there is, for female sexual function, also for male sexual function, and then you might ask about the endocrine support for something like grandparenting, particularly grandmothering, for example. Not a whole lot's been done, however. So just to illustrate, these are data from a nationally representative US sample. The sex difference in vasopressin levels diminishes with age. So it's one thing to study fathers and vasopressin in 25-year-olds. It may not be the same looking at 65-year-old men's hormones and caregiving and sex from young men. So just to bear that in mind. So with Justin Garcia and Amanda Gesselman and colleagues, we thought we'd look at age-related changes in sexual function of singles. So there are a number of large representative samples that have looked at age-related declines in libido and sexual behavior and masturbation and so forth. But one of the complicating issues is that most individuals in these studies are partnered, So it's difficult to separate out the effects of aging from partnership. Furthermore, the longer you're in a relationship, the more that libido tends to decline, particularly for females, it seems, in some studies. And thus, it's hard to, again, pull out the age-related aspect of senescence, sexual senescence in this case. So what did we find? There are robust age-related decreases in our measures of sexual behavior, ideal frequency of sexual behavior, perceived changes in sexual behavior, etc. Although, interestingly, sexual satisfaction increased with age in women, but not men, even though older women were having less sex. There were also sex differences, as you'd expect, based on the larger literature. To visualize a couple of these, you can see males and females with age. These are cross-sectional data, but again, you can see the really robust age-related pattern of declines in these sexual measures with advancing age. Again, what does that have to do with hormones? We didn't measure hormones here. There are some studies, though, that have looked at the role of hormones in female sexuality with advancing age, including the menopausal transition. And in this recent review paper, Kim Wallen and one of his students pointed out that exogenous estrogen appears to have stronger effects than androgens. And in this paper, they also point out this is at odds with the clinical literature in which most of the emphasis has been on giving testosterone to women, not estrogen. So it's an interesting mismatch of clinical treatment and larger comparative and human evidence. An illustrative study from Melbourne, Australia, during the menopausal transition. Menopausal phase 1 is the first 3 months since your last period. Phase 2, 3 to 12 months since the last period. You can see that measures like sexual libido decline during that time. And though not shown here, estrogen was a better predictor than testosterone of those declines than testosterone. What about hormones and grandmothering? As of now, we basically have pilot data. So Mark Flynn has unpublished data from, I think, 7 grandmothers in oxytocin in the Caribbean island of Dominica. In Jamaica, my same Jamaican pediatrician colleague, Maureen Sams-Vaughan, and I spent a summer measuring hormones of postmenopausal women. We had both grandmothers who lived with and provided regular care of a grandchild aged 5 years of age or younger, and then grandmothers who had less interaction with the grandchild. They did not live with them, our controls, because everyone basically had grandkids. We didn't have like older non-grandmas we could find for controls. And the only finding that we had was that the grandmothers had higher vasopressin levels than the controls. And there was also no difference in the grandmothers on a day when they spent the previous 4 hours in caregiving of that young grandchild versus a day when they did not spend the previous 4 hours engaged in caregiving of that same grandchild. But again, that's all we have at this point for hormones and grandmothering. We clearly need more on this, especially again when you look at the dog literature. How much has been done on dogs? Don't you guys like your grandma too? Give her some applause in the shape of research. What about testosterone in aging men? In a newly published longitudinal study in Denmark, middle-aged men who were single and became married had steeper declines in testosterone than those who were married and became single, for example. So again, longitudinal causal effect you can observe here. In a large US representative study, the men these are older men who did not have kids, had higher testosterone levels on average than the men who'd had kids. But we could use more on male testosterone and family relationships at advanced age as well. Because there's also tons of this going on. How many of you have seen something on the internet or on the side of the road from New Mail or some other equivalent? I regularly work at a coffee shop across the street, basically, where Carol and I met last week, across the street from Senescence. You've no doubt seen their ads in the back of airline magazines. They are one of the main proponents of anti-aging medicine, which entails, among other things, testosterone and growth hormone treatment. So a grad student, Nick Ivanoff, and an undergrad, Jimmy Vong, and I engaged in this study recently in which we did content coding of 49 of these kinds of websites, And we also coded whether or not they seem to be targeting young or older men, so men age 40 or younger or men 40 years of age and older, to see what kinds of themes recur in these sorts of testosterone supplementation for sale websites. What are the patterns? Above all, you're selling something, folks. So most commonly mentioned themes refer to advertising. Product information, purchasing information, using people in lab coats who look trustworthy. I'm sorry I didn't wear my lab coat up here. I would look more trustworthy to you. Don't believe a word I've said, because I'm not doing that. Among older men more than younger men, these themes of youth, aging, vitality, and longevity feature more often. That's 73 times this was coded versus 41 times among younger men. And the number of websites was evenly split. I think 25 were geared towards younger men, 24 towards older men. So you'd expect roughly a 50-50 split. But there were more of those towards the older men. And then the most commonly mentioned outside of advertising themes were muscle and sex. We all heard sex sells, so does muscle, especially for younger men. But older men less concerned with, at least being advertised less with muscle or sex themes on these websites. And you can embed this in larger discussions of age-related changes in male mating and parenting effort. So to summarize, human families have changed both with respect to hominin evolution, so how our human hunter-gatherer literature speaks to differences in families compared to our ape kin, as well as the families in which we're all raised, and we can study around the world today how those compare with the family relationships as studied by hunter-gatherers. Hormones and life history are a part of this study, insofar as it represents that complementary integration of proximate and ultimate causation we do Tinbergen proud. And there are several key life history allocations that feature in this endeavor: current versus future reproduction, mating versus parenting effort, and partnering versus caregiving. And that latter one has attracted relatively little attention, particularly in advanced, in more aging populations, even though it warrants much more attention than it's received thus far. So I'd like to thank all of you, and I'm going to go retro, also thanking folks going back a number of years, including PhD advisors and so forth, and a particularly warm shout out to Frank Marlowe, a former HBES president that some of you know has had to retire for health reasons, but I would not be here without the help of so many people who've helped get me here to this podium and so forth, as well as in my postdoc mentor, I will say, I spent 2 years in a lab in which you're giving men testosterone or placebo to ask about effects on cognition and mood and so forth. So that was deeply ingrained in my head and speaks to that content analysis, but many collaborators, many students, and so forth. So thank you. John says we have 10 minutes. I see a question.
Am I supposed to go there? Okay, I'll just go. Thank you very much for a very impressive presentation. I'm making my question very simple. You just had one slide on Hong Kong kids doing math, and hormones do not have to be neurotransmitters. You don't have to mention neurotransmitter. It's not a topic of the talk today. Mm-hmm. But can you imagine the future that there will be more studies done on neurotransmitter and or hormones of those who are engaged in academic works and specific areas, music aside, maybe math, medicine, mother language, geography, and law, neuroscience, psychology.
So there already is at least some degree of literature on exam taking and hormones like cortisol. I'm reading Bob Sapolsky's Behave, and he alludes to some of this literature. So there already is some of that for adult exam taking and hormones, but it mostly looks at the stress axis. I don't know that literature all that well to speak to it in more depth, but I think we may see more stuff like this in kids too. To parallel the adult hormones and competition literature, there's been tons of research that often shows, among other patterns, you see bigger effects in naturalistic athletic contests outside of a lab than you do in lab settings. But the more salient the stressor, like this, folks, we all know, this is salient in a way that if I'm just talking and practicing at home in front of a mirror, I'm not generating the same stress response as being up in front of an audience of esteemed peers and so forth. So I do imagine we'll see more done like this, including on kids, because this has just not been done at all on kids previously.
Thank you.
With regard to the intranasal studies of oxytocin and vasopressin, when they are done in dogs, I mean, do we have any ideas how many puffs of intranasal oxytocin or vasopressin we need for them, given that there is discussion about if it reaches the human brain at all when we do it in humans? Are there studies on dogs where they look at if these hormones really affect the brain?
So the question was on the dosage of the intranasal oxytocin and vasosprays, and including on the dog studies. So I don't know how physiological the resulting oxytocin levels are in the intranasal sprays given to the dogs. I don't know. That's an excellent question. They did, in one of those papers, show, though, that they could measure blood oxytocin levels after the spray to show that it was having at least some effect. But as some of you know, in the literature, there's debate about how the mechanism by which those effects show up in the blood too. But I don't have a deeper response to this. A couple things to bear in mind, though. The doses given and relative to the naturalistic stimuli and the patterns of the hormonal responses to competition or orgasm or other stimuli, those are often discrepant. Period. And that's worth bearing in mind. So on one hand, it's cool that you can do experimental stuff, manipulating a hormone to test causally its effects on some behavior, but the way in which you're manipulating the hormone is not necessarily representative of the way in which the endogenous hormone would be manipulated by the same stimulus. The other thing is to say that literature rarely has naturalistic behavioral measures in them. Usually it's done in a lab. And that's great because you can control more, but it also means you know less about how relevant those findings are to day-to-day realities that are often messier than the labs.
That was lovely. I have a tidbit, a family joke that won't surprise you, but you might enjoy it. When our first grandchild was born, we decided to do a family study, and we're analyzed the testosterone. Nothing comes out from those small samples, but oxytocin. So not from the baseline to what happens after the baby, no. But I'm coming to my daughter's apartment and I spit in a tube in a taxi and freeze it. I spend 2 hours with the baby. It was a 63% jump in the oxytocin. And then my husband comes a week later, and even before I give him a hug, I say, sit here, baby. He comes in, and there was a little bit of a bump after 2 hours, but nothing significant. 2 days later, another 2 hours, and just by coincidence, the same 63% bump. So you're right. I mean, it's something that is going to be worth looking at because it's definitely there. I mean, grandchildren, puppies, come on.
Yes. Yeah, and wonderful anecdotes, and it just, again, speaks to in 2017, this dog literature is marvelous, what we've seen the last few years, but someone grab and run with the grandfathers and the grandmothers because there's a story ready to be told.
I think it's the MMPI. It was a question which asks, would you rather kill a cat or a dog? Now the interesting thing about this question is the Air Force have found in the US that a certain answer to this question predicts leadership qualities. And I guess you can guess which answer you give would predict the leadership qualities, i.e. the dog answer, the cat answer. We'd rather kill a cat, make better leaders apparently. So this could be consistent with what you're saying about oxytocin and gains in dogs versus the sort of negative oxytocin inhibition effect in cats.
Yeah, and my understanding is that Paul Zach's group, I think they did a documentary where they have some other data on oxytocin responses to petting a cat, but that warrants follow-up study. If you're into cats, by the way, there's a great book called The Lion in the Living Room that came out by a journalist last year, but it's relatively short. I don't like cats all that much, but this is a great book, and I'm going to use it in an online class on anthropology of animals, but just a shout out to the cats. Say the last part again.
What do you know about timing of sexual development in male humans or primates or relative to others?
Primate sexual involvement?
Timing of male sexual development.
Oh, timing. Well, one of the things, well, the sexual development there can be various measures of that. One thing I'll just throw out there for contemplation. So James Hyam and Jim Roney, who's here, co-edited a Hormones and Behavior Special Edition that just came out on field studies in humans and non-human primates. And in our review paper on there, we speculate whether or not a 10-year-old interacting with a girl, like a boy interacting with a 10-year-old girl, let's say, that he's attracted to, would that increase DHEA or androstenedione? No one knows, but there's a literature in adults that talks about a courtship response in men's testosterone or cortisol. Some of you in this audience have contributed to that literature. We don't know in kids, but in terms of sexual development, first crushes or sexual attractions occur before puberty. And there's reason to think maybe something like this could be happening, but it's not been tested.
Hi, Peter. You seem skeptical about whether ancestral humans would have cycled quite a bit. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the research suggesting ovulatory effects on both men's and women's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that have been found over the last 10 or 15 years?
Well, I think they're complementary, but I think maybe two things I would say then. One is, if you're looking at an evolutionary history, so apes in the wild, hunter-gatherers, natural fertility populations, the data are pretty clear. Most of female reproductive years are spent not cycling. But when they do cycle, there's a lot at stake. So we need more done, I think, on pregnancy and postpartum lactational amenorrhea and all these other aspects of partnership choice and sexuality and so forth. The second thing would be, in today's world, or even in hunter-gatherers, before you've had kids, but you're looking for partners, maybe there's a role with other like your parents, may or may not have roles in some hunter-gatherer societies with arranged partnerships, especially the first one. In that sense, the literature looking at cycle-related effects on sexuality and other phenotypes makes sense to be looking at these things. There's a lot at stake, and you'd expect some estrogen-related, as Jim Roney's shown, estrogen-related more so than testosterone-related, and also progesterone negatively predicting some of these outcomes. Let's say cycle-related shifts in female sexual desire. That makes sense to be looking at some of these things. So in that way, it becomes complementary to suggesting we need more of a spotlight put on pregnancy and lactational amenorrhea. But in that way, they're complementary in the latter way.
Compared to humans, the great apes are not having babies constantly. Orangutans, more like 6 to 8 years between babies. So is there much literature comparing the hormone situation between great apes and humans?
There is some. Most of that literature in orangs is focused on the two morphs, the idea that you might be a larger flanged male with your huge fleshy cheek pads and long calls booming through the forest versus the smaller guys. And part of that's development, part of that is responsive to social cues, it seems. So that's where most of the orang literature is focused, to my reading of it, rather than, say, fathering, because it doesn't make as much sense to be looking at fathering. Females seem to prefer, as Cheryl Knott has shown, for example, the more dominant morphs to mate with. But as far as other primates, there's some work on baboons, I think Chacma and Hamadryas. And the Chacma, I think, has some degree of overlap with some of these discussions about...
Are all these primate mothers going through constant menstrual cycles?
No. No, again, primates in the wild, no. These are... You're usually pregnant or in a state of lactational amenorrhea, and then eventually you have the energetic capacity to return to fecundity, but that's all, because of the energetic demands of nursing over a long period and so forth.
We have a coffee break. Thank you very much, Peter.